What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And have you ever sat there and thought, I can't play competitive Pioneer because I can't spend $400, $500, $600 on a deck to go and play at my RCQ and qualify for my dream of playing at a regional championship and eventually a Pro Tour? Well, some of you might have had that thought, but thankfully, I'm here to help. I got 3 budget decks for the Pioneer format that are going to be some pretty good options to pick. There's a lot of fun decks to play. They do some pretty powerful things, and even one of them is kind of a tier 1 deck. I'd put in like in that tier 1.5 status that ends up being, fairly decent, and if you stick around, you'll find out at the end which deck it is. But of course, before we get into any of the decks and talk about what they offer to the format, especially to like a budget player, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. I do a lot of modern, Pioneer, and long form content. Also have a podcast that goes up on Saturdays called the Casual Spikes Podcast with my co-host Randy. If you want to go and check that out as well, I got a playlist for that series as well. On top of that, if you want to see any of the deck lists or you want to join the Discord server, all of those links will be in the description down below. So with that out of the way and with all that said, let's go ahead and check out our first budget deck for the Pioneer format. So first off, here we have Aoria Spirits, $280 in tabletop, and you get quite a few cards that are kind of, staples of not only Pioneer but Modern as well. So you see here, you have 1 Cavern Souls that you can get. I don't know if the deck necessarily needs Cavern Souls. This deck is playing 25 creatures, so you could potentially play more Caverns if you have more Caverns, but I think 1 is probably fine. You can get 4 Hallowed Fountain for the deck, 2 Mutavault, an Aoria. These cards see play, in various formats as well. You have cards like Brazen Borrower as well. Typically you're only ever playing like 1 copy of this card, but having 2 is like totally fine, especially since the effect plus the creature that you get is decently powerful. And Curious Obsession as well for some other blue-based like aggro decks is pretty neat. So with that said, what is this deck absolutely like? What is it offering you to the Pioneer format? Well, it is kind of like this tempo-y kind of aggro strategy where you're kind of playing on your opponent's turn and trying to disrupt them. So stuff like Mausoleum Wanderer, you can play, on turn 1, and like you can counter like a Thoughtseize or something like that with this to kind of protect your hand. You can also play something like a Spectral Sailor on your opponent's turn, and pairing these creatures up with something like a Curious Obsession, so you're able to kind of like put a Curious Obsession on a Spectral Sailor. It's going to become a 2/2 because the Curious Obsession is going to give it +1/+1. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you can draw a card. The only drawback to it is that if you didn't attack with a creature this turn, you sacrifice Curious Obsession. You don't even have to attack with the enchanted creature. You just have to attack with a creature. So Curious Obsession is a little bit worse when you put it on a creature and you only have one other creature to attack. Your opponent kills that creature. Well, you're going to have to sacrifice the Curious Obsession. Even though you could have attacked, and your opponent killed that creature, you can't. So that's something to kind of be careful of. But Curious Obsession, once it gets going, players that played this in Standard back in the day, and even a little bit, kind of in like the, Pioneer-ish format, like in the beginning days and stuff, will tell you that this card is very powerful once it gets going. If you have this stick around for a few turns, it's going to end up drawing you 2, 3, 4 cards, which is pretty good in a deck that is trying to play like this kind of like tempo strategy where it's drawing extra cards and wants to make its land drops. You have cards like Slip Out the Back to kind of protect your creatures, and it's going to put +1/+1 counters on them. Get Lost is like some pretty decent removal. Geistlight Snare is potentially a 1-mana counterspell that is, as long as you can pair a Curious Obsession with like a Spirit. And, it doesn't even necessarily need to be on the same one, but you get the idea. If you have any of these spirits in play, you have a Curious Obsession in play. Geistlight Snare is going to be a 1-mana counter spell unless they pay 3, which is going to be pretty good. It's going to allow you to kind of stay lean on your lands, where if you're stuck on like 2 lands, but you kind of have this like combo going, Geistlight Snare is going to be able to counter and then potentially play another creature. And of course, from there, you're going to be able to play like Shacklegeist, Rattle Chains, Supreme Phantoms, Petty Theft on Brazen Borrower, and leave up a counterspell as well as like protection and stuff like that. Spell Queller is another neat spirit in the deck where you can, essentially counter cards like Supreme Verdict. Cards that say they can't be countered, Spell Queller doesn't necessarily counter them. It just like captures them and holds on to them until it dies, and then the owner is able to recast that spell. But definitely a good way to be pretty tempo-y where your opponent is just like, okay, I'm going to blow up the board, and you can say, no, I'm going to not only counter your spell, but I'm also going to add, 2, potentially 3 to 4 power on the battlefield. And could it potentially swing the game, towards lethal, or put your opponent dead to any one of your other like flash creatures, and they're kind of having to, keep up their defenses while also having to deal with like your counter spells and, again, potential flash threats. Lastly, we have Evasion of Gobakon, which I think is how that's pronounced. And this is like some additional disruption. You can play this and look at your opponent's hand, then you can kind of like take a card from it, and it's going to cost 2 more for them to cast if they want to play it. And when you defeat the battle, you can make you can get a enchantment that at the beginning of your end step, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn, and then you can sacrifice it, give your creatures hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. It's kind of a good way to kind of keep the offense going while also having some potential protection in a pinch if you absolutely need it. If your opponent's spell kind of gets around like these counter spells, these cheap counter spells, or you can't Spell Queller or something. So definitely something to kind of hold on and think about. The sideboard as well, pretty decent. You have Catilda's in the sideboard, which could potentially be very powerful. She gets +X/+X, or rather is ***, where its power and toughness is equal to the number of spirits and enchantments you control. Very powerful. And protection from vampires as well, which is very relevant against one of the best decks in the format in Rakdos Vampires. You have Mystical Dispute. You have Wedding Announcement as like a good grindy option. Tocasia's Welcome. Whenever a creature, one or more creatures with mana value 3 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. So this is another way that you can kind of be grindy. Skyclave Apparition is another spirit that is going to be removal for permanents that are non-land permanents, non-token as well, that have converted mana cost 4 or less. Rest in Peace is another good graveyard option. Portable Hole, cheap removal that is not very easy for your opponent to get rid of. And, aside from something like a Braid or like Brotherhood's End, which probably does come in against this deck, Portable Hole is going to be able to stick around, and get rid of like some annoying permanents. So that is Aoria Spirits. Again, like while probably not the very best of like the budget options, it is a deck that kind of offers a different style of gameplay from what you see from the format, where you're kind of playing this tempo-y strategy where you kind of get to make these decisions where like, okay, am I going to play a creature on my turn? Am I going to play this creature defensively, or am I going to try to play it offensively? There's definitely some decisions there that can be made, and obviously some upgrades that can be made to the deck as well. But as a budget option, this one's fine. Again, not the absolute best one that you can play on a budget, but definitely a deck that offers a different gameplay experience from all the other ones, and which is why I think it's worth notating it. And it's always a deck that I feel like is a lot better than what it actually is and how it's actually represented. So definitely something that's worth kind of kicking the tires on and experimenting for yourself if you choose to pick up this deck. But yeah, that's Aoria Spirits. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next deck. The next deck we have is Insidious Artifact. This is a deck that has been around for a little bit. The beginning stages of Pioneer. This is a deck that people kind of gravitated towards because they remember how powerful it was in the Magic Origins kind of standard format, where you just get to make a 5/5 on turn 2 and get to attack with it. Is pretty powerful, especially if you get to put it on something like an Ornithopter, which is not in this list and is probably not there for good reasons. But essentially, this deck is a hyper-aggressive aggro deck that can just deal tons of damage out of nowhere and kind of can catch a lot of opponents by surprise. So, Is based around this card, Insidious Artifact, that is essentially going to enchant an artifact, and the creature has a base power toughness 5/5 in addition to its other types. So, if you enchant something like a Smuggler's Copter, it's a 5/5 flyer that when it attacks, draw a card, discard a card. Pretty easy. When you have a card like, and I don't know if it's actually in this list, it is Darksteel Citadel, which makes no sense why it wouldn't be here. Darksteel Citadel, you have an indestructible 5/5, obviously very tough to actually deal with. Then you have cards like Combat Courier, which you can then make into 5/5s, and then Spyglass Siren, which makes map tokens that you can make into 5/5s. Voldent Epicure, blood tokens can be a 5/5. You have these different things that you can kind of enchant with Insult Artifact that are going to make 5/5s and be attacking on the early turns of the game, especially if you start off with a Spyglass Siren or a Voldaren Epicure, even Combat Courier as well, as like ways that you can, play an Insult Artifact on turn 2 and just be hitting for 5 points of damage. Obviously with Spyglass Siren and Voldaren Epicure, you're going to be able to hit for 6 because you're going to, obviously have the creature as well. You have Inti, which is going to, when you attack, you can discard a card, and if you do, put a +1/+1 counter on attacking creature you control, gains trample. Pretty good when your creatures are 5/5s. Especially getting to play this like on turn 3 and, potentially leave up something like a Gleeful Demolition, torch the tower to kind of like clear the way, maybe another Combat Courier, what have you. And then Inti says whenever you discard one or more cards, you exile the top card of your library, and then you can play it until your next end step. So this allows you to kind of get some, impulse draw, like card advantage that isn't going to force you to get rid of it at the end of that current turn. You're going to be able to play it until your next turn as well. In this deck, of course, we talk about like the closing speed of it. Yeah, you're attacking with a 5/5 on like turn 2, a lot of the time, and ideally. And then you're following it up with something like Shrapnel Blast, which makes you sacrifice an artifact as additional cost. But for 2 mana and sacrificing an artifact, you deal 5 damage to any target, which is a lot of damage. You can get rid of things like a Shieldred, or you could just get rid of your opponent entirely by just getting in, points of damage, like finding your kind of finding your lane in getting in, and then Shrapnel Blast out of nowhere just ends the game. Especially 2 Shrapnel Blasts, having your opponent at a virtual 10, and then you're hitting them for 5, 6, 7 points of damage a turn is a lot, and a lot of decks just can't handle kind of like being that aggressive. Not a lot of decks can handle a creature that is that big, especially, something like an indestructible threat like a Citadel or a flying threat like Smuggler's Copter. The mana base as well, you have like Den of the Bugbear, which is another kind of like staple card. You have Otawara, again, kind of another format staple. Soakin' Zen, not so much, but definitely a good card to have. And then 4 Spirebluff Canal and 4 Steam Vents as well. And a budget that's under, even under $250. These cards see play in Modern and Pioneer plenty enough. Smuggler's Copter is kind of like the hotness of like the Pioneer format. One of the reasons to play it. You have Voldaren Epicure as well as Spyglass Siren. For some of the other formats as well, Inti in the other variants of like Rakdos Midrange, Reckless Bushwhacker. I don't know if this sees much play in like the Boros Convoke decks, but there as well, and even Gleeful Demolition, which can just put a ton of power into play. Put 3 power into play by destroying one of your own artifacts. Something that you just made for free off of one of your Siren or your Epicure is pretty good as well. Sideboard as well. Rending Volley is a mainstay in like sideboards. The Unlicenser, same thing. Rampaging Ferocidon, especially in a format where we have something like Amalia, is pretty sweet. And playing a Hazara as well is absolutely nuts. But I'm here for it because I absolutely love this card. So definitely some good cards to be playing in the deck. And a lot of like format staples passes. So definitely a good deck to kind of build into, to kind of have like that super aggressive slant where you can kind of win out of nowhere. Again, you can catch some players off guard. They maybe don't respect it, don't really know what's going on, and they kind of like panic, and you can win some games and even matches, kind of like making your opponent figure out what the heck is actually going on. So that's Is It in Soul. Let's go ahead and take a look at our last deck of the Pioneer format on a budget. Finally here, we kind of have like the best of both worlds between the kind of Aoria Spirits and the Is It in Soul deck, and that is a Boros Aggro. While the deck that probably has the least amount of like format staples that you're going to find that can kind of branch into other decks, this deck is arguably is definitely probably the best, at least the most accomplished between the other 2 decks that we've seen, and definitely offers a different kind of game plan as well. A little bit harder, I think, to play in terms of kind of like mulligan decisions and making sure that you're kind of set up to actually try to win the game and play around certain things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect. A lot of like the downfall of this deck is that you play 16 creatures and you're looking to kind of load up on one of them with all of these pump spells and pseudo protection spells. So obviously like Illuminator Virtuoso is like one of your best creatures. It's a 2 mana 1/1 double strike. Whenever you target it with a spell, you connive, which can has so much potential when you're combining it with cards like Defiant Strike, when you're going with stuff like Monstrous Rage, where it's going to be +2/+0 until end of turn. The monster roll token is going to give it +1/+1 and trample as well. So this is kind of like the Teamer Battle Rage, to like Illuminator Virtuoso, because it's going to make it huge. You're going to be able to connive, potentially get counters on it, what have you. 10th District Legionnaire is going to get counters on it, or a +1/+1 counter when you target it, and that's Scry 1. So you're able to kind of get a little bit of value in that way. You have Swift Spear, which is going to get bigger when you play more spells and is not going to require you to target it for it to get bigger. And then Favored Hoplite, which is going to get +1/+1 counters when you target it, and it's going to prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn, which works pretty well with stuff like Reckless Rage, where you're going to be able to target it. You're going to deal 4 damage to a creature you don't control and 2 damage to a creature you control. It's not going to matter because the Favored Hoplite is not going to take any damage from it at all. It's going to be able to swing in and potentially deal even more damage. The problems that you end up having with this deck is that if you have these draws where you have like 1 or 2 creatures and your opponent's able to remove it and you're not able to adequately protect it with something like a God's Willing or like a Lauren's Escape or even a Sigiri's Shelter, you're going to be very sad because you're just going to have a ton of pump spells. You're going to have to target at your opponent's things to draw cards to try to find, any one of these other threats. However, if you are able to stick any one of these threats into play and you're able to adequately load up on it, protect it, etc., your opponent is going to be in for a very bad time. So we were just pointing out like Illuminator Virtuoso and like a Monstrous Rage, especially like this, having that Wicked or the Monster Roll token put onto the Illuminator Virtuoso is going to deal tons and tons of damage, and that's kind of like mitigating the, the saving grace that you have against Illuminator Virtuoso normally is just by being able to block it forever, and your opponent just kind of like dealing damage. You're just really hoping to avoid like Ancestral Rage and Monstrous Rage as well, which are probably the best like pump spells that this deck has to offer. In terms of like cards that kind of branch into other formats and stuff, really Spikefield Hazard could potentially be, but I think that's pushing it a little bit. Any like Monastery Swift Spear is like a red aggressive creature that you can kind of play in other decks as well. You have Battlefield Forge is like fine. Inspiring Vantage is okay. With it being a single reprint in Standard, if Standard is like a format that you like to play, definitely a good card to kind of pick up. 1 Mana Confluence, definitely needing to pick up 3 of them is going to be kind of brutal past us to play any of the other decks on the format that play Mana Confluence, but I guess having 1 is like kind of fine. If you don't want to play it, it brings the budget of the deck down to under $200. Needle Verge Pathway is like fine. It's, you can play it on red or white, and then 4 Sacred Foundry as well. The sideboard, nothing really of note either. We saw Rending Volley in like the other deck is kind of a staple. Damping Sphere is a bit of a staple. Shutdown of the Scalds, while fun, I don't think necessarily fits kind of like that staple status that we're kind of looking for in kind of these other decks. But that said, this is a budget deck that is very good in the format currently. You can just win a lot of games out of nowhere, kind of like with the Is It In Soul deck where you can just deal tons of damage, out of nowhere. This deck can literally just end the game with an Illuminator Virtuoso and the right set of pump spells. You can just kind of, load up on this thing and win the game if your opponent taps out at the wrong time, in conjunction especially with something like Swift Spear and then Virtuoso and then like a bunch of pump spells. Swift Spear is going to get in tons of damage, and Illuminator Virtuoso is going to get in an absurd amount of damage. So while definitely of the 3 decks, this is the worst for, getting format staples and, being able to branch out and maybe build into some more expensive decks, this deck in itself is probably going to be the best performing one out of the 3 on a consistent basis once you kind of like learn, your mulligan decisions and, things that you need to do to make sure that you can actually have an adequate amount of creatures and pump spells to actually be able to close out games and picking when the right time is to actually play them. So that is 3 budget decks for the Pioneer format. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what budget decks maybe you're playing in the format. I would love to hear some different options, especially links to some deck lists as well would be really neat. Speaking of links to deck lists, if you want to play any of these decks, I'm going to have them all linked down in the description down below, along with my Discord server as well if you want to join over there. Consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell to get notified when I post future Modern and Pioneer longer form content videos. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one.